Good morning, and my name is Professor Jeff Noonan. I'm a philosophy professor at the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And this videotape is my contribution to the Third World Cultural Forum, sponsored by the School of Marxism at Shandong University. And before I begin, I want to thank Professor Lian for his invitation to contribute to to contribute to the conference. I decided to entitle my contribution "Marxism Will Heal the Sick." It's a reference to a fabulous painting by Frida Kahlo that hangs in the Almeida collection in Mexico City. And if people know Kahlo's work, you'll know she was terribly injured in a car accident, and issues of disability and health and well-being permeate her work. And this is a kind of utopian painting looking to the future, a socialist future, where disease has effectively been banished from the world because under a socialist society, we can devote our resources to satisfying human needs. So, as the COVID pandemic continues to grip parts of the world, including where I live, we're currently under the third provincial lockdown. And I'm going to talk about the class dimensions of that in a little bit. But I wanted to speak more generally to issues of capitalism and health, the social causes of morbidity and disease, or the social determinants of health, and then conclude with some brief thoughts about whether and how Marxism will cure the sick if we can speculate about a socialist future. I'm not going to talk about the practical and political challenges to accomplishing that in different countries, but I will make reference to what I think a Marxist understanding and a Marxist approach to issues of health and disease might be. So let me begin by talking about the way in which COVID has brought into rather sharp relief class, racial, and gender conflicts. And my focus here is North America, United States, and Canada, mostly Canada, where I live and where I work. There's of course some significant differences between the history of Canada and the United States, but there's also significant overlap and commonalities, more so than perhaps people outside of North America appreciate. Canada somehow maintains a reputation for some kind of compassionate social democracy that, for the most part, it does not deserve. So, COVID, beginning more about 14, 15 months ago, uh, not only paralyzed the world economy for a time being, but it exposed the consequences of capitalism generally and 40 years of the neoliberal model of managing capitalism. And what it exposed in North America, both Canada and the United States, but here I want to focus on Canada because Canada does have a public healthcare system. What it exposed is how woefully ill prepared a purportedly public healthcare system was for dealing with a public healthcare crisis. Right? 40 years of cutbacks, driven not only by openly right-wing governments, but also the centrist Liberal Party of Canada, which purports to want to invest in people and public infrastructure and public investment. Both the Conservative and the Liberal parties have contributed to decades of cutbacks, which really left the hospital system, the public health care system, public health protection woefully inadequate to respond. Right? Canada has not been hit as hard as other countries, in particular the states, and the fact that we did have a public or do have a public health care system, weakened as it is, allowed the country to respond more effectively early on, especially to the crisis. But the underlying social structures of capitalism also operate here. So, just to give a few statistics before getting into some more theoretical discussion, right? In the latest so-called third wave, which is being driven by variants that first emerged in England and Brazil, We've seen positivity rates of upwards of 20% in working class immigrant communities in Toronto, which is more than double the provincial average, right? More generally, we have seen uh, um, uh, cases track poverty and racialization, right? The most affected people by the pandemic, uh, both in Canada and the United States, have been racialized communities. I think there's a paper in the Lancet, and people can email me if they're interested in the precise reference. Majority African American counties in the United States have seen rates 3 times the population average. Early on, the first wave of the crisis here in Canada, old folks' homes, elderly care facilities were particularly hard hit. So a number of residents died, hundreds and hundreds, but also the personal support workers who care for them, the majority of whom are racialized immigrant women, right? A number of them died, and they died explicitly, and nobody denies this, because, at least in part, personal protective equipment was not provided, or adequate personal protective equipment was not was not provided. So, what can we say about this from a more systematic, critical perspective? The COVID crisis has re-emphasized the importance of the social determinants of health. And I want to talk a little bit about their importance to a Marxist understanding of health and disease. Now, the social determinants of health were not invented by Marxists, right? The pioneering work was done in the UK by Michael Marmot and Richard Wilkinson, and there's been important work done in Canada as well, right? But when you apply a social determinants of health model to understanding any disease, not simply COVID, what it discloses is that there is a background set of social, political, cultural, and economic causes that make people more susceptible to diseases. Right? So, disease is not simply a function of the invasion of an individual body by a pathogen, right? It's a function of your circumstances of living, right? Your housing, the type of work you have, whether that work is secure, whether there are unionized protections, right? It depends upon your sex and your race and ethnicity. It depends on the part of the city you live in. It depends on your housing conditions, your level of education, right? All of these produce what Marmot calls a gradient, right? A health gradient, right? And the higher up one goes in the socioeconomic ladder, the better healthcare outcomes we observe. So this shows us that if we want healthy bodies, we have to have healthy societies. There has to be a commitment to the satisfaction of fundamental human needs, not simply biological needs, but our social needs like education, right? Like time off work, time to socialize, right? And that has really been emphasized under the various lockdowns that people have been subjected to at different times and different places. How important it is just to get together as human beings and to laugh and have a drink and talk and relax, right? So, the social determinants of health has kind of fundamentally important implication that we have to look to how societies use their resources if we want to understand who gets sick and why they get sick. But what the practitioners, what the pioneers of the social determinants of health typically don't do is to look at the underlying drivers of investment and economic prioritization in a capitalist society. All of the important thinkers who have contributed to the development of the social determinants of health point to inequality, right? The more unequal a society is, the worse the health outcomes for those as we go further down the scale. But what they don't do, and what we have to do if we want to really start solving these problems at a structural level, is to connect inequality to its causes in the political economic dynamics of capitalism, right? And that starts with recognizing why there are classes. Now, people at the conference um, after all, it's being sponsored by the School of Marxism, are not going to be surprised by what I say, but it's worth reemphasizing. Inequality is not a function of bad public policy. In a capitalist society, inequality is a function of class structure, right? And that class structure is determined by the fact that a minority of people own and or control the means of life for everybody else. So at the deepest level, and this draws on my own work and the work of another Canadian philosopher, pioneering work of another Canadian philosopher, John McMurtry. Uh, this shows us that capitalism is rooted in the subordination of what we can call life value, the satisfaction of our basic needs, both biological and social, to money value. So, just to illustrate the point, in the current situation in Ontario, one of the main battle lines has been around paid sick leave, because what's driving the current round of the third wave of infections is the fact that working class people are still having to go to work, often in dangerous, ununionized conditions, and they're getting infected at work. They're bringing it home, and it's a cycle back and forth, back and forth. But workers have to go to work in a capitalist society, right? We don't use our resources to satisfy our needs. We have to work for a wage and exchange that for the commodities that our lives require. So the fact that workers can't escape work is what's driving this round of infection, right? But the bosses aren't rushing to provide paid sick leaves, because, of course, the interest of the boss is to exploit labor to keep profits flowing. COVID or no COVID, it doesn't matter, right? What they see, and this is a function of their class position, it has nothing to do with their personalities or their emotional dispositions towards others, right? They're driven to do this. Why is this important? It's important because if we want to solve the problem of inequality and the healthcare problems that inequality causes, we have to get back to the root of the problem. The opposition parties in Ontario and in Canada have been pushing the provincial government to step up and provide paid sick leave, and that's fine. They should be. But that doesn't solve the deepest problem, which is, of course, the class structure that ensures dependence of working people on the dynamics of the capitalist society. And unless we get down to that problem, we're never going to finally and fully solve the other problems that inequality causes. So that brings me to the final point I want to address, which is whether and to what extent and how Marxism will cure the sick. Will it restore us all to perfect and pristine health? Will it lead us to great leaps forward in terms of life expectancy? Will it lead to, as some technotopian transhumanist thinkers believe, some sort of practical immortality? I don't know what the deep future holds. Who knows what things will be like in 10,000 years? Very different from now. But Marxism is a political philosophy. It has to deal with the relatively near term. Right? It's not science fiction. We're not looking thousands of years down the road. What does a socialist society prioritize? Right? Once it deals with the problem of class structure. And I think it prioritizes basic healthcare needs of everybody by ensuring not access to fabulous technologies and medicines and all that. That's one part. It's a very small part, actually, of overall population and individual health. That's another implication of the social determinants of health, right? Machinery is fine and fantastic if you're super sick, but most of us aren't super sick all the time. Fundamental healthcare needs track fundamental social and economic needs. So the first thing Marxism would prioritize is immediately correcting the vastly different healthcare outcomes of exploited and oppressed people. That has to be the priority. Right? if you make a comparison between the Canadian and the American healthcare systems, right? The American healthcare system is fabulous at keeping rich white people alive seemingly forever. Dick Cheney, for example, right? They just keep going and going and going. It's not so good at satisfying the more basic healthcare needs of African American populations, of working class people. Obamacare improved the situation, but it hardly solved the structural problems. Canada does a bit better in that regard, unless you're talking about indigenous communities, many of whom are in the north, but also in the cities, who have much, much worse healthcare outcomes because they are more impoverished, because they face racism, because they live in isolated communities without access to doctors and nurses, and so on and so forth. So I think we reverse the priorities of a privatized healthcare system. Instead of looking at healthcare as something that makes money for healthcare corporations and drug corporations, we start from the ground up. Who has the most need, right? From each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, is the principle of distribution in a developed communist society, Marx says, right? But in the transition, as we're trying to reallocate socially, collectively produced wealth to the satisfaction of needs, we have to look to the people whose needs have been most unsatisfied, right? So improved healthcare outcomes doesn't mean, taking the life expectancy of the rich from 90 to 95. It means elevating the floor globally and nationally. But beyond that, and this, my concluding points here draw on other philosophical work of my own that I think has a connection to a certain interpretation of Marxism, but also draws in other sources. Right. I also think that Marxism, as a form of historical materialism, has to accept what I've called in other works the frames of finitude. Right. Human beings are organisms. We're social beings. We're cultural beings. We think. We communicate. We make art. We laugh. We cry. But we're also organisms. We're animals. Right. And as such, we're born and we die. And I think this is of fundamental importance. Right. I think historical materialism and Marxism concentrate on improving life and making it as good as it can be within these frames of finitude. Right? I don't think we ought to have any truck with transhumanist fantasies about immortality or practical immortality or downloading our consciousness into computers. I don't know about you, but had it been possible, I would have much rather come to China to deliver this in person and meet people. It's great that we have communication technology, but I'm tired of living my life one-dimensionally through a screen. I don't want to download my consciousness into a computer network. I want to be a three-dimensional material being and contribute my labor, intellectual and otherwise, to making the world as good as it can be. And then when it's time, ceding my place, right? I need to go so other people can be born. And I think that kind of, and I'll conclude on this point, connects back this idea of life value to the values of a socialist society. A socialist society promotes the use of resources to satisfy our fundamental needs for the sake of developing our capacities, not for the sake of making us into quasi divinities, but to improving our social life, to enabling each of us to contribute, to forge relationships, and to enjoy the spectacle. To enjoy our time here, and then to um, uh, leaving the planet, because at the end of the day, that's what it is to be an embodied being, right? So a certain liability to disease, to morbidity is built in. And socialism doesn't try and take it out. If you ask me, it tries to satisfy the underlying conditions which will ensure our health. And with that, I will wrap up. Solidarity greetings to all of you, and thank you again to Professor Lian for the invitation to contribute. And with any luck, the COVID crisis wraps up soon, and perhaps we will meet in the flesh sometime in the future. Thank you.